My first record was a sampler called Fill Your Head with Rock, comprising mainly West Coast American CBS Records acts. And although I played it to death, it was barely satisfactory. I wanted a straight shot of adrenaline. A second-hand Deep Purple in rock, scratched to bits, cost 50p in an auction of albums because somebody needed to pay their tuck shop bill. Now, my friends, we were cooking on gas. A family trip to Jersey, that's the Channel Islands, not New Jersey, folks, netted brand new gatefold versions of Van der Graaf Generator classics H2HE and Pawn Hearts. The latter was such a manically depressive album that you could actually empty a room with it after a couple of minutes. On the other hand, I could listen to it for hours on end in solitary confinement, probably because I'm not a manic depressive. Anyway, I took the two albums out of their brown paper bag. The gatefolds had some rather splendid surrealistic artwork by Paul Whitehead. I showed it to my father, who was an amateur oil painter. "What do you think?" I offered. "Degenerate," he replied scathingly. We spent the rest of the day in silence. I decided that given a choice between being beaten at waterboarding school or being looked at as if I had two heads, I would take my chances back at school. I was determined to spend as much time as possible away from home and set about signing up for school trips, army placements, and whatever I could lay my hands on. During summer holidays, I moped around town, hanging around record shops and pressing my nose up against the glass of guitar and amplifier stores, lusting after speaker cabinets and hardware. My exposure to bands, albums and the stage had grown into a fantastic dream world. I had a transistor radio with a small earplug, and I would listen to pirate station Radio Caroline, the scratchy sound fading in and out under the bedsheets at night. I had memorised Deep Purple's Made in Japan, note for note, every drum beat, every thud of Ian Pace's bass drum beater I had tried to replicate. Ditto the first Black Sabbath album, Aqualung by Jethro Tull, plus my eccentric collection of Van der Graaf Generator albums and treasured copy of Wild Turkey's First Offering. Back home in Sheffield, I still had some friends from prep school. Seeing as we'd all been packed off to boarding schools, holidays were the only time we ever met up. Paul Bray was one of them. Paul had a drum kit in his garage. A real one, actual cymbals, the whole shebang. He was in a band and his guitarist came to visit. I sat in awe as he rattled off Layla and half a dozen cream standards. He may well have ended up as a chartered accountant. Paul is actually quite a successful solicitor these days. Life's like that. Back then I was spotty, wore an anorak, had flared blue jeans with Purple and Sabbath biro engraved on the thighs, and rode an ear-splittingly uncool moped. Oh yes, and I wanted to be a drummer. My parents would have been horrified. It was my guilty secret. I had a pair of drumsticks, which I kept hidden, and a practice pad. Their intention was that I should be a doctor, vet, accountant, solicitor, or some other professional occupation. I returned to school and set about forming a band. When deprived of something essential, the human mind is capable of surprising and often perverse adaptability. The Marquis de Sade, denied paper and sexual contact, solved both problems by writing down his increasingly feverish fantasies on toilet paper, recently retranslated by an academic at the university where I would shortly end up. But now we really are overreaching ourselves, so let's presently deal with the past. The bands I listened to were not the bands I would ever see in their heyday, stuck as I was in boarding school at the time. So my imagination filled the gaps. I overlaid their on-stage antics in my mind's eye, with some operatic stage setting plus the energy from the improv drama I'd engaged in. It was all very fevered, very intense, and I wanted to recreate it as a drummer. It was simply a question of activity, and drumming was frenzied. It was the thrashing around at the front of the stage, it was the sweat and the focus, but also the possibility of being a Keith Moon, an eccentric, a showman. The drummer, it seemed to me, was in the driving seat. However, I possessed neither a driving seat nor a drum kit. Amusingly, a drummer's chair or stool is technically termed a throne, and whilst I admired the sentiment, the delusion of grandeur was of no practical help. I conscripted several volumes of the Cambridge medieval history. My drumsticks were strips of plywood, and I arranged the leather-bound volumes like tom-toms round my small, rickety desk in my study. With a speaker close to my ear, I battered them in hopeful symphony. Eventually, I snuck into the music room and purloined a pair of bongos. There were kids at boarding school in possession of real drum kits, amplifiers and electric guitars. They rehearsed in commandeered classrooms on a Saturday or Sunday afternoon. I gate-crashed one of their rehearsals. It was disorganised, and it was all about how cool they looked. It was about fashion, about posing. Actually, about nothing. I was disgusted, although slightly jealous about their equipment. I was searching for the holy grail of innocence and experience. My vision was cloudy, but my purpose was crystal clear. Entertainment, yes, but truth above all things. 4 of us formed a band, at least for 5 minutes. The bass player, an Australian called Mike Jordan, had made his own bass in the woodwork and electric workshops. He was also my partner in crime when it came to running the school War Games Society. He had failed to evade the curse of the school choir and had a classically trained bass voice. 2 acoustic guitars completed the ensemble, and we attempted to play one Saturday afternoon. The only song we could agree on was Let It Be by the Beatles, so we gave it a go. Hideously out of time, and with my hands beaten raw on the bongos, we staggered towards the chorus, at which point Mike realised that classical bass voices did not really suit extended Liverpudlian baritones. Let It Be dissolved into a strangled yelp, while I carried on beating the song into submission on the 2 available skins. We stopped. I was disappointed, as my enthusiasm was overcoming any pretence of accuracy. Mike could not handle the vocal high notes. He cleared his throat, and sounding terribly grown-up, said, "Perhaps we might change the key." Well, I didn't know what he was talking about, but I chimed in with, "How does it go?" I opened my mouth and let rip, and the guitarists carried on to the end of the song. My head was spinning with the vibrations from the resonance of my voice. There was a surprised silence when we ran out of talent at the end. "You can put those fucking bongos away." Mike, our bass player, admitted defeat. "I think you are our vocalist, dear boy." Our future in the music business thus secured, we broke for tea, margarine, jam and toast. It was 6 p.m. after all. My acting endeavours had continued to flourish, and I had started writing and even directing after a fashion. The Dark Tower was a radio play by Louis MacNeice, which I adapted for the stage, playing the oily butler myself, as well as directing and producing it, all with the encouragement of my mentor, Mr. Campbell. My fencing classes had turned into a full-time, official school sport. Having won the school fencing championship, I was declared school captain of fencing, and I had my picture taken, looking pompous with prominent sideburns. Bullying was no more. I began to resemble the institution that I had resented. I was being assimilated, absorbed into the fabric, as if the beatings and hypocrisy were simply a test, something every chap has to go through before he changes from a caterpillar to the right sort of social butterfly. My status, I suppose, was best described as slightly eccentric but acceptable. All that was to change on a dark November evening in 1975. The week leading up to my exit was unremarkable. I spent spare afternoons in the study of my guitar-playing friend Chris Bertram. An unlikely duo, we pillaged the B.B. King songbook, murdering the blues, and I discovered that I could scream like a banshee and rather overdid it. But then, that's what adolescence is for, isn't it? By now, I was in the 6th form, only months from taking English, history and economics at A-level. There was no element of coursework. It was sudden death. 3 hours of essay writing, and if you kept your wits about you, you might do okay. A couple of evenings before my demise, there was a comical but depressingly despotic event that took place at a lecture on Machu Picchu and the archaeology of the Incas. It was delivered by an academic explorer who also happened to be a personal friend of the headmaster, the automotively initialed BMW Trapnell. Trapnell was a cosmologist by trade and had an emollient effect on parents and also, one imagines, school governors. 5 minutes into the lecture, The plug was pulled on the slide projector, and in the chaos the slides were cruelly rearranged in what was clearly a very cleverly executed hit. The aftermath descended into a Nazi-style persecution. Names were taken, and the order from the top was clear. Punishment beatings were in order. Pride was at stake. A birch was used to personally beat those deemed to be the ringleaders, and it was administered by Mr. Cosmology himself, a big man, and sadly for their bottoms, a very good fives player. After the event, there was tension in the air. The school was in an angry mood, but no one would storm the Bastille. Most inappropriately, therefore, 2 days later, there was to be a celebration in Sydney House, the joyful construction of a new dwelling for our illustrious housemaster would be commemorated by the convocation of the entire authority structure of the school. The flogging cosmologist, the deputy flogging cosmologist, plus the flogging rowing kit fetishist, and all the school prefects assembled at one dinner table. The food was to be cooked by the more minor prefects in the house. There was an atmosphere of quiet anarchy. I sat in a study with Neil Ashford, who was 16 and pretty bright, to be honest. We had a one-ring electric hob and a bottle of cheap sherry under the desk. We were just chatting, minding our own business, and slightly tiddly, when there was a knock at the door. The sherry was hurriedly stowed, and a prefect stuck his nose round the door, holding a block of frozen runner beans. "I say, I couldn't borrow your hob, could I? We've run out of cooking rings," he said. We nodded assent and consigned them to the saucepan. We watched the beans defrost, then start to bubble and boil. Around this time, we both felt the urge to urinate. Through careful coordination and impressive bladder control, we relieved ourselves into an empty milk bottle. I did have a flashback to being one of the three witches in Macbeth. As I poured our mixed consommé into the bubbling pan, I found myself recalling eye of newt and toe of frog, wool of bat and tongue of dog, add thereto a quarter bottle of piss. A classical education is a wonderful thing. The mixture bubbled away, and 15 minutes later, the prefect appeared and pulled out a tasty morsel. "Perfect," he pronounced. We realised that the house was devoid of authority. All were busy, fawning, bowing and scraping to the jailers and floggers, in search of self-promotion, I assumed. So we tiptoed to other studies and, like a pair of Pied Pipers, managed to obtain the keys to the house bar in the attic. And then we locked ourselves in, with several barrels of beer. Down below, Neil and I could see the silhouettes and shadows of the Last Supper. Not for them, but for me, as it turned out. We slowly sipped our pints of Marston's pedigree and started to giggle. The rest of the bar, half a dozen errant souls, wanted to know what was so funny. Being daft, we told them. By break time, 11 a.m. the next day, the whole school knew. I realised that I was some kind of breathless hero until lunchtime, when one of our house prefects declared me depraved, disgusting, and an abomination. After lunch, the abomination was summoned to the housemaster. "There's nothing I can do to save you," he told me. Well, this was a surprise to me. I never thought of him as the Messiah, and I certainly didn't now. I was called to see the headmaster, the cosmologist, the wielder of the birch, the flogger of the minor transgressors, the king rat. I put on my overcoat and took a contemplative slow walk through the dark November fog. I would be out, but I would not be broken. After all the bullying, the fencing, the drama, the music, this was it. The showdown. Admitted to the warm head magisterial study, I sat down in front of Mr. BMW. His feet were crossed over. Very big feet, I thought fleetingly. He spoke almost absent-mindedly. "This is not the kind of behaviour we tolerate in a civilised establishment. I must ask you to leave the school, therefore." "Therefore? You have to be kidding me. In what century, from what misanthropic ivory tower did this creature originate? The hypocrisy, the twisted regime, the cover-ups, the maintenance of good order over all principles of humanity. Therefore, fuck you." But I didn't say any of that. I just smiled and looked him in the eye and thought, "You have eaten my piss." "Any preference as to when you would like me to go?" I said. "Next week? End of term?" "Tomorrow morning," he shot back. "Oh, that's clear. Is that it? You may go." I closed the door gently, with a satisfying click. The cold, damp air felt good. I was out. I was on my own. I'd taken a pot shot at the system, and by God, I think I winged the blighter. Chapter 7. Lock Up Your Daughters. Winter, leading into spring and summer and culminating in my 18th birthday, was a period of cleansing and essentially re-entering the human race. I was allocated a place at King Edward VII School in Sheffield. It was an ex-grammar school, now a comprehensive, but with a good academic reputation. It was mixed, girls and boys, and, shock horror, it was friendly. I waited for the hierarchy to become clear for the punishment beatings, but nothing of that sort went on. I wondered about what might have been had I not been packed off to boarding school. There was little point in attending the school, except for the legal requirement to do so, because in a few months I would have to sit my exams, and unfortunately, the exam board in Sheffield was radically different from the one in Oundle. I spent lots of time in the library, mugging up on my Norse mythology, rather than studying. I joined the Territorial Army as a private. My number was 2440525, and the sergeant said that I was too clever to be a private and asked why I didn't wait to become an officer at university. I told him that I just wanted to get on with it, so he issued me with kit, and that was that. Our unit, D Company, Yorkshire Volunteers, was, in theory, on 24-hour call in the event of a war. We would be sent direct to the front, with mortars and rocket-propelled anti-tank weapons, one of which was given the surprisingly cute name of the Wombat. Our life expectancy in combat, I was informed, was 1 minute and 45 seconds. I got drunk with a lot of steelworkers dug holes in inhospitable bits of Northumbria and got to carry a big belt-fed general-purpose machine gun which used a lot of bullets, all of them blanks. Otherwise, I shovelled shit on the farm, of which there was a great deal, and drove tractors and dump trucks, laid concrete and constructed fences. I converted my anger into the physical, and I felt a relief from the rage that had burned continually at boarding school. Then, one English class, one fateful lunchtime, I heard mutterings from the back. "Oh, we don't have a singer for rehearsals tonight." I turned round and suddenly recognised my drumming buddy, Paul Bray. He had two very cool dudes who already looked like seasoned rock professionals flanking him. Hi," I began nervously. I sing a bit." They looked me up and down. I was a bit pudgy, with an awful short haircut and terrible trousers. "Brilliant. See you at 6 o'clock. It would be 9 months till I was due to start at university. Time to listen to Radio Caroline under the bed, draw fantasy stage sets, and rehearse in my mate's garage on a Tuesday evening. Limbo ain't a bad place to be. Our band had a real drum kit and 2 guitars, and the bass player had his own gear, a self-contained amp and speaker. The rest of us shared one Vox AC30. 2 guitars, plugged in, plus the new vocalist, me. My microphone had been snipped off the side of a portable cassette recorder and spliced via sellotape onto a longer cable and thus into the Vox combo. It sounded truly awful, but the band were light years ahead of anything I'd experienced up till then. They'd learnt half of the album Argus by Wishbone Ash, plus All Right Now by Free and the inevitable Smoke on the Water. After one song, and letting rip my Ian Gillan shriek a few times, they all nodded sagely. "You are the new singer." Well, I asked if they had a name. "Paradox," came the reply. I thought it was a rubbish name. I regarded home in Sheffield as being a kind of holding pattern. I didn't feel as if I belonged, but then it wasn't an unpleasant existence. It just seemed as if I was walking on eggshells unless I was outside digging holes or shoveling horse shit. The local pub was a 20-minute walk, which was arduous in deep snow, and on the way was the old German prisoner of war camp, complete with half-demolished prison huts. Beyond that, down a steep hill, was the bus stop, and above it, looming Bram Stokerish in the moonlight, the Fulwood Isolation Hospital. On 2 occasions, walking back from the bus stop in the darkness and wind, I met people wandering in the road, confused. I had to wait until I could flag down a rare passing car to get them to safety. I suspect now that they might have had Alzheimer's. They would almost certainly have died of exposure, left to their own devices. In the 70s, people were simply loopy, and that was that. Having done my good deed for the day, fate returned the favour. We actually had a gig. We debuted at the local youth club, with at least 4 people in front of the stage, and the rest pinned against the wall in sheer terror as we hacked our way through smoke on the water. I think they had the 4 tops more in mind. I'd spent 15 quid on a half-decent mic, a Shure Unidyne B, which had a ridiculous stand that could lose its legs and vertical integrity suddenly and for no obvious reason. I had a tambourine and had saved up for a very old pair of Vox 4x10-inch speaker columns. Signing on for the summer, my dole check appeared in the post, and I had enough to buy a 60-watt Carlsberg guitar amp from a second-hand store. Now we were all equipped, but with no gigs to go to. I turned salesman. I went out and doorstepped publicans who had gigs. I scoured the ads in the local paper for bands and then went through the phone book to find the number of the pub where they were playing. I bullshitted for England, but there was no evading the awful truth that came with the question, "Do you have a demo tape?" Well, of course we didn't. I forget how we made one in the end, but anyway, it was awful. I think we just put a cassette recorder at one end of the garage and made a racket. Somehow, we got a booking at a pub called the Broadfield, and we may even have done a second gig. We were paid 3 quid, as well as 1 dog-eared hamburger and a bottle of Newcastle Brown apiece, and had to sign a receipt. Next was a council-sponsored afternoon in the park, in Weston Park, just by the university, and up the road from the Royal Hallamshire Hospital. A local DJ from Radio Sheffield turned up, but he'd been in the pub all afternoon and was quite possibly on acid. The headline band was called Green Sleeper, and they had that bored air of insouciance, born of being the biggest thing in the postal district and doing gigs every weekend. They had a following, which turned up just before and left immediately after they played. We were left to set up on the small stage in bright sunshine. There were some green fold-up chairs and some kids eating ice cream and squinting at us. We started to play. The drum kit was shifting around and the stage was not held together, so it started moving apart as well. At which point, a ne'er-do-well gentleman jumped on stage shouting, "Shut up, I'm trying to sleep!" He pushed the guitar amp off the back of the stage, which was only 2 feet off the ground in any case. I seized one of the fold-up chairs and hit him with it, and he just staggered backwards and then walked back down the hill, straight through the empty lines of chairs normally used for old ladies to sit by the bandstand. Fuck, I thought. This is like The Who! But it wasn't really, and the DJ on acid said so in his radio programme that night. Nevertheless, with our newfound notoriety, I pressed hard for playing our own material and a name change. Paradox was too wishy-washy. We needed something legendary. How about Sticks, I suggested. Isn't somebody else called that? Oh, they won't notice, I stated confidently. Our second appearance at the Broadfield was also our swan song, but our first as Sticks. We even had badly photocopied handouts with wiggly letters made by sticking individual letters to paper with glue, but not quite in a straight line. The tambourine was now polished aluminium, and it twirled around, but you had to be careful in case it severed the blood vessels around the base of your finger. I was trying to be cool. Picture this. Lumberjack shirt, because Rory Gallagher wore one, waistcoat with lots of badges on it, and hush puppies. Lock up your daughters, South Yorkshire. We had one self-penned song called Samurai. The lyrics were not mine, but a fellow sixth-form poet who contrived to combine the samurai with vultures and to rhyme flesh with creche in the same line. Cool, I said. What's a creche? We decided to split up on a high, citing commercial pressures plus the fact that the two guitarists had summer jobs wearing wooden clogs and cleaning out steel furnaces, which paid rather better than the £3 we got paid in our final appearance. Among all this, it was easy to forget that I was meant to be taking my final exams. I'd done little studying. Actually, I had nothing to study. I had a box of history notes. Economics I thought was a load of rubbish made up by academics to create jobs for themselves. And English was fun to create, but oh my God, just the cover of anything by Jane Austen made me want to eat my own leg rather than drag my way through it. Anyway, I sat my A-levels having not read a single book for the English exams or opened many textbooks for economics. History, I reckoned, I could probably blag, because I was actually interested in it, which was probably a good thing, because I would be spending 3 years of university ostensibly studying it. I can't remember what I wrote, but incredibly, I passed all 3 with the lowest possible pass grade, an E. Even more incredibly, I had an offer from a London university who wanted me so badly that they only required an E grade in 2 of the 3 subjects. Thus, with no wasted effort, I entered the halls of academia, Queen Mary College, University of London. Chapter 8. Mini-busted. I was in London, with an agenda, an aim, but no plan, and a government grant, putting actual money in my pocket. My first problem was surviving the day I arrived. I was immediately summoned to the head of the history department, Professor Leslie. He held up the piece of paper with my A-level grades. "What is the meaning of this?" he demanded. Well, I did have a little problem. "What problem?" "Well, you see, I was chucked out of school and I had to home study." "Why? Why were you thrown out?" Drinking," I offered. He pointed at me, and his eyes looked like giant gobstoppers behind the twin television screens that were his glasses. He also had an alarming resemblance to Mr. Toad. "I have got my eye on you," he declared. "My spies will be watching you. A student needs only a bed, a chair, a desk, and a suitably illuminated light." "Well, thank you very much," I replied, and, breathing a sigh of relief, I headed directly to the Student Union bar, where a fantastic pint of Bass lay in wait, priced at a quarter of the cost of beer in a pub. Happy days. I had a plan, cunningly concealed from my parents, and in truth, even from myself. They were puzzled by my choice of a history degree. "What use is that?" they asked. "Useful in the army," I replied, but the thought bubbles around my head told a different story. I had a plot. Anything to get out of here, and if I'm going to be a rock singer, it must be London. But I can still join the army if it all falls apart. And here I was, almost out as soon as I'd arrived. I sipped my pint. Priorities, I thought. Number 1, virginity. Must lose it, and fast. I put an end to my military ambitions once and for all by joining the London University Officer Training Corps. I won't dwell on the subject. I turned up to the drill nights, and they were dreary affairs compared to running around the Northumbrian desolation of Otterburn with machine guns and steelworkers. It was more a gathering of chinless wonders intent on dressing up in ill-fitting uniforms and boots that had never seen mud. I soon fell in with a lot of drunks, a very mixed crowd, and discovered they were called medical students. This, I thought, was the beginning of the end for virginity. So I began a career washing coffee cups late at night after the pub shut, in the mistaken belief that doing useful things might make a 19-year-old dental student swoon. Well, eventually she did swoon, but not before I discovered that she was a virgin too, and worse, could recite chapter and verse the pharmacology of birth control. Well, this removed the frisson of pure lust, but replaced it with a comforting reliability based on sound clinical practice. Practice we did, though. That taken care of, I set off in search of rock and roll and the secret of the universe, and it was only Friday afternoon. You don't have to be Sherlock Holmes to spot musicians, especially rock musicians. Either wandering around in a daydream or driven by a burning ambition, they're often given away by guitar cases, drumsticks, or a copy of the Melody Maker turned to the classified adverts in the back. As quaint and faintly ridiculous as it sounds now, Melody Maker was the only serious magazine for adverts of musicians wanted, gear for sale, studios available, van for hire, and all things rock and musical. It was a broadsheet, basically black and white. Interlopers like Sounds magazine had colour centrefolds of newspaper-grade quality, large sheets of toilet paper, in order to make inroads into Melody Maker's circulation. So I just spotted a Gibson SG being carried, out of its case, by a slight, curly-haired guy. "Hiya, nice guitar. What kind of stuff you into?" I asked. Priest, Sabbath, Purple." So in the space of 30 seconds, we had a band. Martin Freshwater was his name, and he knew a bass player called Adam. Then we unearthed Southend's very own John Lord, Noddy White. Bits of Noddy looked like Noddy Holder of Slade, hence the name, and I never found out if he had been born with another one. Noddy taught guitar, had a double-neck bass and six-string combo, and an organ that didn't sound nearly as impressive as it looked. All we lacked was a drummer. Steve was the only non-student, and I've utterly forgotten how we found him, but he lived in Catford and had more drums than I'd ever seen in my life. We found a large room in the disused kitchens of the halls of residence, set up some kit, and made a noise. The walls were tiled, and the stainless steel sinks created a natural tinny reverb, so the whole experience was like playing inside a biscuit tin. I asked Noddy to show me how to play guitar, and I slowly crabbed and clawed and contorted my stubby fingers into the requisite shapes. Immediately I started to write, and the first thrill of creation soon turned to frustration without the ability to create form and structure. I never forgot the initial joy, the thrill of that moment of inception, of meaning. Even if it only meant something to myself, and even if it ultimately was deemed rubbish. There was a purity in the art of creation. By now we'd worked up a small repertoire, and all the material was our own. We were basically ready, or so we thought, to get some gigs. But we needed a name. Names are vexatious things. They can unwittingly define and doom a band to perdition, or, even worse, to be damned by faint praise. A name creates the tightrope that every band walks. Rock music walks that tightrope for eternity. Too pomp, too punk, too serious, too laughable, too out of tune, too technical. Actually, none of it matters as long as you stay on the tightrope. In fact, it's exciting to watch as you wobble, but it's hell if you fall off. In 1977, punk was in full flow, and Queen Mary College, Mile End, the East End, was smack bang in the middle of it. The Pistols, Secret Gigs, The Jam, Bethnal, a punk band with a violinist. What's in a name? We played way too fast, and the more excited we got, the faster we played. Speed, Noddy suggested. Speed? I queried. Yeah, 'cause we played too fucking fast. None of us, and I mean none of us, had any idea that speed was a drug, and a rather popular one for a culture that hadn't discovered and anyway couldn't yet afford cocaine. Beer was the only drug in town. In the student union, after 5 p.m, there was a gaggle of music fiends who stood by the jukebox and fiercely disagreed every day about the same things. They shouted at each other and remained friendly at the end of it. Future world leaders and football supporters, take note. The Union Bar contained all shades of red, from light pink in high heels to communist scarlet with blood-stained hatchets to bury in the heads of the filthy capitalist oppressors. As an avowed contrarian, I stood up and opposed a few of the more silly motions in public debates. It was worth it just to wind up these po-faced and self-important arbiters of student political opinion. The Socialist Workers' Party rep was always polite but intense, a duffel-clad class warrior. We would have entertaining arguments before he decamped to plot the coming apocalypse, leaving me with the thought that I was on the list. The Titanic, I reminded him, also had a list. and look what happened there. There were, however, departments in the student union that actually did things as opposed to talking about doing things. Entertainment seemed absolutely the place to go. The entertainment officer was elected by students along with his or her deputy and essentially became a student union-funded concert promoter. Queen Mary had, and still does have, an extraordinary facility, the Great Hall. Built in the 1930s as the People's Palace, it had one of the largest proscenium stages in London. Now it's been modified as more of a multi-purpose space, but back in 1977 it was still a theatre with a seated balcony and a large floor which, for gigs, was devoid of chairs. I started out as a volunteer by pushing boxes around and loading in and out for various bands. I assembled the Atom Henge for Hawkwind, and these days I drink in my local pub with the drummer, who's now one of the UK's leading authorities on waste recycling. At the same show were the Reformed Pirates, minus Johnny Kidd himself, who of course had been killed in a car crash some years before. The guitarist, sadly now deceased, was called Mick Green, and he is pretty essential listening for any guitar player. Variously, Manfred Mann's Earth Band, Ian Dury and the Blockheads, Lone Star, Racing Cars and Supertramp all adorned the People's Palace stage. The BBC used it for a series of sight and sound in concert broadcasts, and all the shows were open to the public. I did a bit of everything, from front of house to backstage and security, and a lot of truck loading. From the sold-out psychedelia of Hawkwind to the smell of dirty old cookers and musty carpets was a reality check, but in our little rehearsal biscuit tin, Speed built up a repertoire that was an interesting but very odd mix. If we were a garden of sound, we would have been a mangled tornado of dead leaves and twigs, with the occasional daffodil visible through the browned gale-force fugue. My two self-penned, very primitive guitar riffs were called FBI and Snoopy. I possessed a large stuffed version of the cartoon character created by Charles Schulz. Snoopy abuse was a prominent feature of the show, and I wish I could tell you why. Our first gig was at the Green Man in Plumstead, where we played to not a lot of people. Snoopy was disemboweled and we played extremely fast and largely out of tune. It went down a storm and the promoter gave us a residency once a month. To get to and from gigs, we borrowed the college minibus. It had seats and windows, so the seats had to be removed and the bus loaded up out of sight, then rapidly driven through the gates before somebody realised that the windows were full of Mr. Fender, Mr. Marshall and the big stuffed white dog with the black nose. After all the gear was in, there was no room for people, so we had to travel by train. We would then sneak back after the gig and replace the seats before dawn. My first year at university wasn't half bad. I saw a lot of bands and played in a band. I learnt to play bad guitar, wrote my first songs and did gigs. Time to move on, up and in, or maybe that should be down and out. Chapter 9. Going to the Dogs. If my account sounds strangely devoid of much in the way of historical studies, that's because as I progressed to my second year, I wasn't even turning up to most lectures. Very occasionally, I would drink 2 or 3 pints at lunchtime and wend my way into my medieval history tutorial. My tutor was a very nice old lady, and I think she might actually have experienced most of the Cambridge medieval history she so adored. I can't remember anything about Charlemagne or Frederick II, but I do remember that the sunshine was very bright and interfered with my daydreams as it streamed through the hazy window that framed her silhouette. I was now the full-on entertainment officer. I had an office, went to committee meetings, and I had a budget. Most crucially, I had a telephone with an outside line and a hotline to every agent in town. Suddenly, I had a freshers' week to organise, booking bands, discos and all that good stuff. I think I ended up with Fairport Convention as the main event, and the whole week was extremely profitable. I made about 20% on top of my expenditure. I was hauled before the committee and told I was a disgrace. "This is just exploitation of the student body," I was informed. "So, you want me to lose money as a general moral principle?" I inquired. After the Inquisition, I gave the problem some thought. I'd never seen Ian Gillan, one of my vocal heroes. So I phoned up his agent and booked him. Money, no object, I said. In return, I suggested, might there be a few pub gigs he could point in my general direction? Speed was fun, but constrained. To borrow a song title from my future, I had a burning ambition. The telephone, of course, gave me the ability to respond to adverts in Melody Maker. One in particular seemed promising. Vocalist required to complete recording project. I phoned up. Just one problem. Do you have a tape? Well, of course I didn't. The guy I spoke to was a recording engineer and also the bass player. It was free studio time, and I'd never been in a studio in my life. The influences, though, sounded like a shoo-in for me. Purple, Sabbath, and delightfully, Arthur Brown. He, Ian Gillan and Roddy James Dio were probably the three singers you could refer to and say, aha, I see where Dickinson nicked that from. I should recount my history with Arthur Brown, one of England's wackiest performance artists and one of rock music's most insanely talented voices. The first time I saw him was at Oundle when I was 16. Kingdom Come was the band and the album was called Journey. The concert was, for me, a mind-blowing shamanic ritual. I've never tried acid, or mushrooms, or any hallucinogen, but with Arthur that night, I didn't need to. Deep, and I mean deep, analog synth sine waves scooped your eyeballs up and planted them in stereo where your ears should be. The single screen of blobs and lights and stars compressed time to a singularity. Then Arthur hit the stage, dressed in face paint and a gigantic headdress, standing like an Aztec king before a gigantic tripod, and raised his hands in sacrifice and intoned, in a dark, extended baritone, a command to strip the rust from your soul. Now time slips, atom centuries, on a wave computes before eternity began. Oh, who cares if it sounds like hippie bollocks? I can tell you, I thought I'd seen a glimpse of God that night. In 1976, Arthur had a band with no drummer. On top of that tripod was not an altar, but the Bentley Rhythm Ace drum machine. Arthur wasn't sacrificing or blessing us. He was fiddling with the analogue tape loops of each individual drum, all of which ran at different speeds, and he was probably cursing frequently in frustration. No one but a madman would even have attempted it. There was a lead guitarist and a bass player, and two keyboard players with every kind of analogue synth going, VCS3, theremin and mellotrons. Somewhere in the midst of this falling into a musical black hole experience, two fellows came on stage dressed as brains to be beaten with a stick, and men danced around dressed as traffic lights, inspired and deliciously potty. Fire is the best-known track of Arthur's, and this alone is enough to secure him a place in rock's pantheon. But all of his albums with Kingdom Come and As the Crazy World of Arthur Brown are worth exploring. Pete Townshend was the associate producer of The Crazy World of Arthur Brown. The whole idea of The Who's Tommy came from it, and it's a concept album, one of the first, about a man's descent into hell. And when he opens that door, well, you guessed it. I am the god of hellfire, and I bring you fire. And there was the black voice trapped in Arthur's body, because he could strip the paint off walls when he sang blues standards like I Put a Spell on You. The night I saw him, Arthur planted the seed for what I describe as theatre of the mind, with music as the proscenium arch and your brain as the stage. Anyway, back to my immediate problem. I didn't have a demo tape. I would have to improvise. In my second year in London, I'd moved my lodgings away from South Woodford, a bland, characterless university halls of residence tower block that overlooked the motorway, to somewhere slightly more challenging, but so much more interesting. The Isle of Dogs is the U-shaped bend in the Thames that features prominently in the credits of EastEnders. In the late 70s, it was a desolate, windy and decaying place. Tower blocks sat alongside 30s council flats and houses, all built for the thousands of workers who once populated the London docks. In Tudor times, it was a marsh and a refuge for criminals on the run from nearby jails. Because of the tidal flow, A wall was built, which gradually formed the shape we all know and love. Water-operated mills were built on the wall, hence the mill wall, which ran down the west side of the Isle. Before basins were scooped out of the mud to form the docks, Henry VIII released wild dogs into the marshes. He was fed up of spending money on chasing criminals, so he made sure the dogs were fed up in a rather more unpleasant sense. Tate and Lyle still has a sugar refinery there, and tucked away on Tiller Road was the ground floor flat that was my new abode and the location of my first demo recording. I had a flatmate, but I didn't see much of him, as he would disappear into his lair and only emerge at odd hours of the night. He had long hair, an Afghan coat, goatee beard and John Lennon glasses, and he giggled a lot to himself for no reason I could fathom. There was an upright piano left stranded in one bedroom. Clearly not the object to sling in the back of a car when your days at university are over. It had a mostly operating keyboard, but sounded like a load of dinner gongs being hammered with tortured dissonance. I had a cassette recorder, and only one cassette. On one side was a series of awful easy listening, and on the other I'd recorded some Monty Python. Cassette fiends will recall the curious rituals involved in taping over pre-recorded commercial cassettes. I got busy with a piece of sellotape and then fiddled with the innards of the recorder and eventually had my cassette poised and paused, standing atop the piano. I didn't bother playing the piano, because I couldn't. I stepped well away from the tiny built-in condenser microphone and just yelled a lot, wailing through scales and letting off a nasal shriek and a couple of different vibratos as it faded away. I put it in the post, to the P.O. box listed in the advert. With it was a note in red biro. Here is the demo. If it's rubbish, there is some Python on the other side for a laugh. With that, I resumed normal operations. Go to college, open the post, avoid going to lectures, sort out a rehearsal, daydream a lot, drink 3 pints at lunchtime, go to tutorial, remember nothing, make some phone calls to agents, wait an hour for the 277 bus, eat something, see the girlfriend, pub, bed. There is a message for you, I was told a couple of days later when I showed up to the entertainment's office. This guy phoned back about a tape or something. I grabbed the message. Call Phil on this number. I dialed this number, and a friendly, enthusiastic Brummy voice answered. Yeah, I really liked the tape. You were doing some mad melody ideas, a bit like Arthur Brown. It was 3 p.m. By 6:30 I'd found my way to the studio. It was homemade in a garage, lined with egg boxes and foam. It was Abbey Road as far as I was concerned. For a small Pro-Am studio, it was quite well equipped. It had a small drum kit in situ and lots of cables, pedals and stands to weave past on the way to the vocal booth. I had no idea about recording. I understood what a tape recorder did, and I understood a bit of what a mixer did. Mix, right? But of multi-track recording, I had no clue. The idea of headphones was totally new. A monitor mix was an undiscovered country. Phil played me the backing track. The guitar was pretty cool as well, I thought. A little bit Peter Green, early Fleetwood Mac, Green Manalishi feel. The song was called Dracula, and it had some corny, carry on, fangs for the memories style lyrics, but played absolutely deadpan serious. Try, my only sense of humour's in a jugular vein, and your neck is on the menu tonight, as a taster, and you get the idea. I started to sing, having learnt the song in the control room. Phil leaned forward and pushed the talkback button. How long have you got? All night, if you want, I replied. I could see him leaning back to dial a phone number. Phil played bass and had called his big brother Doug, who played drums. Together, we all listened back at 4 a.m. I'd never double-tracked or harmonised with myself, but I did that night. 3-part ascending choir vocals, big doubled choral pieces. If only the owner of that 3-bedroomed semi whose garage it was knew what he started that night. "We'd better start a band then, I suppose," said Doug. I was most impressed by the fact that they had a battered blue transit van. It performed parcel deliveries by day, and at night it would turn into the most exotic four-wheeled magic carpet, transporting our merry souls to La La Land until dawn, when we all went back to the pumpkin patch with the rest of humanity. But before we could sprinkle fairy dust into that petrol tank, we had to find a guitarist. So an ad was put in Melody Maker. Guitarist wanted for pro recording band. Good prospects. My God, I came over all of a twitter. Pinch yourself, Dickinson. Here comes the big time. Chapter 10. Dope Opera. Speed was not so speedy anymore. We had all moved and were spread across East London. Varying degrees of work plus geography put paid to us, and in any case, our drummer couldn't get off from his job in Catford. Plumstead became Glumstead as we played our last gig, but not before a puzzled audience saw me disembowel Snoopy on the stage at the People's Palace. I knew they were puzzled because I could clearly see the bemusement on the six faces in the cavernous venue. Perhaps they thought they had encountered a strange art installation, or they were simply so appalled that they stayed to see the car crash. Actually, we weren't that bad, just not that good. Doug and Phil lived in a rather swish rented mansion block in Battersea in southwest London. In the 70s, and the 80s for that matter, rents in London were affordable and houses were cheap. One enterprising lad on a social sciences course actually bought a flat during his time at university using his grant as a deposit. Smart cookie. I did something quite different with my grant money. I spent most of it on a PA system for the new band. It consisted of two large pieces of furniture with 2x15-inch speakers buried in the cabinetry. Sat atop were a pair of integrated double 12 inches with a tweeter on top, powered by four 200-watt valve amplifiers, designated as slaves. Power slaves, in fact. I had upped the ante in the microphone stakes and now gripped a gold AKG something or other with a cannon plug at one end and a jack plug at the other. I was halfway to paradise at least. All of which depleted my bank account to almost zero. The nice people at Barclays had given me a chequebook, a bank card and what seemed to be a free overdraft, which was how I fed myself. I was also responsible for not paying my rent. I managed this by not being present between the hours of 9 and 5, Monday to Friday, and if I was present, I hid behind the cooker. After a couple of terms of this, letters started to arrive. Quite a lot of letters, really. Never mind, I thought. One day, all of this will be in a book. In the meantime, I manned the telephone in the rather swish mansion block in Battersea and waited for prospective guitarists to phone. By day 3, I was losing the will to live. If auditioning disciples was like auditioning guitarists, then no wonder Jesus ascended to heaven. At first I listened, and they talked, and they talked. I had maybe 100 names, and we booked them in over 3 days at a rehearsal studio over the Rose and Crown in Wandsworth. I made notes on their stories and their influences and styles. Well, I think I'm as good as Jimmy Page, but maybe not as clever. I like to think myself as a cross between Richie Blackmore and Mozart. I think the guitar is, for me, an extension of my entire personality. Phil and Doug just jammed on a couple of chords, and we watched as the helpless, the hopeless, the hapless, the naive and the outright lunatic failed to negotiate any musical material or collaborate with any rhythm at all, not even their own pulse. At the end of 3 days, and after nearly throwing myself off Albert Bridge into the Thames in frustration, 2 shiny nuggets appeared. Both were over 30, which seemed an impossibly distant age. There was a fantastic Irish guy who'd played in show bands, total pro. Music was like flicking on a light switch for him. But then in walked Tony Lee. Tony was a chilled-out Australian with presence, and when he played, which he did effortlessly, he gurned in a most agreeable manner. He was 30 years ahead of his time as far as facial hair was concerned, and in short, he looked great, and boy, could he play guitar. We called ourselves Shots, but we could have called ourselves Anal Catastrophe and only had to change one letter. It was the era of punk after all. I thought it was a rubbish name as well, but I couldn't think of a better one. We set about rehearsing material and creating an image. Not being experienced at either pastime, I went with the received wisdom. After rehearsals, or lengthy discussions over vats of tea in Battersea, I would bounce around trains, tubes and the number 277 bus before arriving back at the Isle of Dogs. One random night, I unsuspectingly fell under the evil spell not of bell, book and candle, but of glass, resin and matches. Marijuana had arrived, and in the finest tradition of toilet archaeology, shit was about to happen. I had been hammering on the keys of the dilapidated piano when there was a knock at the door. Peering round the door handle was my grinning, pixie-faced flatmate, he of the Afghan coat and John Lennon specs. "Fancy a glass?" he said. I had no idea what he was talking about, but in the spirit of what does this button do, I feigned nonchalance. Why not? I tentatively followed him into his lair. It was full-on hippie headband joss stick heaven, carpets on the walls and ceiling, even on the floor. It was a male boudoir and a temple to a fragrance I couldn't quite identify. He giggled a lot. He was still giggling when he took a badge from his lapel. Students always wore at least 10 or 15 badges, then laid it down, bending the sharp end of the pin to vertical. This was intriguing behaviour. He then crumbled a piece of a brown, mud-like substance away from its bigger brother and rolled it into a greasy lump. He impaled it with great care on the badge like a surgeon would treat a fragile liver before transplant. Suddenly, he lit the lump, swooped a glass over the top of the whole issue and, lifting the edge of the inverted glass, inhaled the resulting smoke before going very red in the face. I was nonplussed. Finally, he exhaled. The glass was still full of the joys of combustion. He nodded at the glass. I inhaled to maximum effect. My lungs felt singed, my epiglottis ravaged by a Brillo pad. But for some reason, I rolled on my back, put my hands and feet in the air, and I was suddenly on the ceiling looking down at myself. I had a few more puffs, and by now had figured out that this was a resinous form of marijuana. Things became funny that were not so before, and I spent several hours perforating the fabric of the universe, looking for the joke. Though I'm loath to admit it, that little puff of dope opened what they might be giants would have called the little birdhouse in your soul. That and a desire to eat donuts. I never got the chance to thank my flatmate because the police arrived and took him away a few days later. He was a generous soul and had sent a large lump of hash in the corner of an envelope via Her Majesty's postal system. Whether impaired by his own fumes or simply impaired in his judgment, he addressed the envelope to the wrong house. The recipient opened it, called the police, and kindly gave them the name and address of the sender, helpfully provided within. I think he was fined £400, and I never saw him again, but whatever was in that piece of dope had not gone away. My yearning was to transfer the theatre spinning through the cosmos of my brain into the very soul of an audience. But there was the problem of image. It was clear to me that I didn't look the part. I also couldn't bring myself to fall into the mire of the fake American rock and roller. Image in entertainment can be everything and nothing at the same time. I had to be substantial. I had no choice, because, judged on image, I was a walk-on disaster. In case you think this judgment too harsh, there's a wealth of photographic evidence. Because the recording of Dracula seemed to be in the right vein, we concocted a sort of pastiche, screaming Lord Such, bargain basement, shock horror band personality. Our lanky Australian wore a cape and a lot of eyeshadow. Our bass player wore a rubber 80-year-old man mask, and I wore green army long johns, boxing boots and a grandad shirt. The pièce de résistance was a gold lame jockstrap. Now, in case you think this may just have been a terrible accident during a game of blind man's buff in a charity shop, I had the gold lame jockstrap handmade. Up in Hackney, East London, was a legal squat, basically a commune of 3 streets in a triangle. In the middle of it were all manner of vegan cafes and rainbow coalitions. There dwelt a lesbian seamstress, who measured me up, somewhat unimpressed, and produced my Sparkly Willy cover. I had in mind Ian Anderson, he of the tramp overcoat and codpiece on Jethro Tull's Aqualung. Although I didn't sound like Ian Anderson vocally, I was a massive Jethro Tull fan, and of course Glenn Cornick, the founder of Wild Turkey, had been an original member. I started to use my limited dramatic skills. A great deal of prancing went on in confined spaces during rehearsals, and twirling inanimate objects while standing on one leg. Fast approaching was our first gig. The owner of the Rose and Crown took pity on us. I suspect because we spent a lot of money in his rehearsal room. There was one person in the audience, and there's nothing quite so lonely as one man in a disco. He sat at a table in the middle of the dance floor, the blue flashing lights reflecting off the mirrored walls. No matter how many mirrors, it still didn't look like a crowd. More gigs followed, and our fame spread as far as Croydon. There, we suddenly came to the attention of an agent who wanted to sign us. He made all the right noises, but said all the wrong things. He had red hair and a comb-over, and was an agent for rockabilly bands, 50s revival acts, teddy boy cover groups, and any form of novelty to entertain awful people. "Brilliant, lads," he said. Love it. Comedy, heavy metal. Hilarious. Love the banter. Come up to the office, sign the contract." And then he was gone. The office was on a damp-smelling first floor above a curry house in Finsbury Park, just around the corner from the Tube and not too far from the Rainbow Theatre, a legendary rock venue, now, sadly, an evangelist church. That, of course, was where we really wanted to be, but this seemed better than nothing. We signed the contract. It said that we promised to do everything and that he promised to try to do something, but with no guarantees. "Brilliant, lads, fantastic, great, comedy, heavy metal, bring the house down." We went away feeling strangely glum and unfulfilled. After a few weeks of nothing in particular from this gentleman, we were offered a gig at an army base in Arbroath, Scotland. Research, plus a map, revealed the truth about economics espoused by Dickinson. When the petrol bill to drive from one end of the country exceeds the total fee available, result, misery. Arbroath being notable for its smoked fish, I went down to the fishmongers and bought some boil-in-a-bag kippers to give us a taste of what might have been. Our agent protested. "Well, frankly, lads, you're blowing a great chance. Extremely disappointing." We consigned our agent with a Donald Trump comb-over to the bargain basement of history and headed southeast, beyond even the mighty metropolis of Plumstead. Gravesend is one of those town names like Leatherhead or Maidenhead, which make Americans scratch their heads and wonder, why? The why, in this case, was probably nautical, and may have alluded to the end of the line, for ships of the line. The Prince of Wales didn't live there, but he certainly gave rise to a few pubs in his time, and shots appeared one dull evening, setting up in front of the bar with the gents' toilet entrance just to one side of the non-existent stage. Masks on, jockstrap firmly strapped, and silver tambourine twirling away, we were enough to stop conversation at the bar, which is always a good start. The big challenge came when patrons attempted to use the toilet facilities, and I decided to conduct a few improvised interviews with them as they stepped into our territory. The more humiliating the better, and the landlord rebooked us. Word got around about the prancing singer, the old geezer on the bass, and the increasingly uncomfortable Tony Lee on black Gibson, black mascara, black lipstick, and no work permit. As we returned to the scene of the crime weeks later, the place was packed, and then, after that, more packed. The landlord was delighted. "Love the banter," he'd say. "Love it," and he would buy lots of beer. Summer of 1978 was, for me, stunning. I was free to roam the London streets with only dreams as my guide, and even then, the liberty to forget at will. I'd resigned as entertainment officer, so I just pottered about the East End, getting a builder's suntan. Because of punk and its DIY attitude to records and record companies, everyone was in on the act now. Self-produced singles on vinyl was standard for rock bands too, but as shots, we were at a disadvantage. We didn't have the cash to have one pressed. Tony, our Antipodean vampire, was showing signs of ultimatum fever. He was older, had actually earned money out of music, and was in a reasonably tearing hurry to do so again. Throughout my third and final year at university, we resumed our gigs in small pubs and clubs around London. We could have papered the walls of a small hamster cage with rejection slips for Dracula. The Prince of Wales was starting to get bored of us, and I think the feeling was mutual. There are only so many times you can try the same gags and the same songs before people begin to drift. One evening, however, we were out loading the van, and I was standing, temporarily unused, when I was approached by three odd-looking individuals. Paul Sampson had a bowler hat, leather jacket, and a moustache, plus shoulder-length hair and curls. He was not unlike a King Charles spaniel. Chris Aylmer was tall, had a mullet, and seemed really quite mature. Barry Purkis had dyed red hair in ringlets, a Nazi stormtrooper dress jacket, fluorescent earrings, and bright red trousers. "Hello," started Paul. "We're Samson. We got a deal, an album, and management, and want a singer. Interested?" "Gary Alton, Heavy Metal Kids, that's the sort of thing we want," chimed in Barry. I can see the Ian Gillan influence," Chris intoned reflectively. "And Kiss and the Residents, mad shit," Barry added. "Mad," Chris muttered. "Yeah, mad," Paul chuckled. "Well, I am very flattered," I replied, "but I've got to finish my final exams in 3 weeks, and I can't do anything until I've got that over with. Is that okay?" "Yeah, all right, we'll be in touch," Paul said, and he wrote down his phone number. I'd become more and more preoccupied with exams, and for the 6 months before my finals had decided to catch up with the previous 2.5 years of academic insufficiency. With no wasted effort, I got a Desmond, a 2-2, or, more correctly, a second-class honours lower division. By the end of the exams, I was starting to imagine that I was almost getting the hang of this academic business. My brain was creaking in all the right places, and I began to wonder if all this activity might have created some permanent impact. I finished my last exam before lunch. I took a deep breath as I turned my back on the great white-fronted main building on the Mile End Road. I took the 277 bus down to the Greenwich Foot Tunnel and walked under the River Thames to the old wharves that lay on the south of the river. Woodwharf Studios was a rehearsal room with a panoramic view of the water, but for today, my destination was the small portable shed around the back. Head still buzzing from cabinet papers about Munich, appeasement, and the fall of France to the Nazis, I opened the studio door. It was 1979. I was 20 years old, and I was about to start singing, full-time, with Samson. Chapter 11. A Heavy Metal Crusade. It was not quite what I expected. There was more gear than I had ever seen in a rehearsal room. Marshall amps, weave-fronted Marshall speaker 4x12-inch cabinets, Paul's Gibson SG, Chris's Fender Precision bass, and, of course, the greatest number of drums I had ever been in close proximity to. While the equipment was certainly not lacking, the will to do anything was curiously absent. I was raring to go, but we immediately decamped to the pub. Thus fortified, we made a start. Sort of. "Shall we start?" I asked. "Nah, let's get wrecked first." And so it began. It was to be 2 years of madness, and yet we still managed to pull off some decent music, plus some variable gigs, although secretly we quite liked it that way. The immediate task at hand was to get wrecked, so I went back to the pub and had a third pint. When I returned, the wreckage had already started. Although I'd been in a band called Speed, I had no idea that there was a drug called speed until a couple of years later. There was a light white crusting on the tip of Chris's nose. He was unusually active, being as he was fairly languid under controlled conditions. Paul, on the other hand, was carefully rolling one of several joints using resin crushed atop tobacco removed from a Marlboro cigarette. This, plus a new echo machine, made for pleasant interludes of overlapping feedback that went on for several minutes. Barry, or Thunderstick as he had named himself, was wearing a blue boiler suit. As the engine room of the band on the drums, he didn't seem to be his usual bouncy self. This, I discovered, was because he had washed down a handful of downers with his pint. After half an hour or so, we launched into a number. Stoned guitar, speeding bass, and a drummer on downers, periodically losing consciousness and threatening to fall off his drum stool backwards. Fortunately, there was a wall behind that prevented this, which meant that he would suddenly wake up and thrash his kit much faster, as if to make up for lost time. I did a bit of singing. 3 pints, I thought, is not enough. In the midst of this quick, slow and stoned routine, the door opened and in walked what I thought might be either a travelling salesman or a minicab driver. He stood and watched. I've never liked being watched in rehearsals. I don't even like being watched by people I know, truth be told. Rehearsals are where you can screw up and feel safe to experiment. Now he started tapping his foot, nodding his head, pursing his lips in the way that people do who know absolutely zero about music. He thought he was important, but he was just irritating. We stopped, but not all at the same time. It took a while for Thunderstick to realise and slowly collapse into his tom-toms fast asleep. "Hello, can I help?" I offered. "Oh yes, I'm Glyn. Alistair sent me down to have a listen, see how it's going." He had quite a strong South African accent, and I was right. He was a minicab driver. The Alistair he referred to was Alistair Primrose of Ram Cup Management, Samson's manager. "We're just knocking it on the head," Paul announced. Short but sweet, the first rehearsal ended up back in the pub. Glyn had a cash float, and we figured we may as well convert cash into food and beer. After an hour or so, we went back to retrieve Thunderstick and found him on the roof, staring at the sun with his eyes closed. He was in no state to walk, so we all sat on the roof, while Chris and Paul smoked a lot more joints. We waited for our respective chemical states to stabilise, so we could go home. I found communication, as I would normally understand it, quite arduous with people who are out of their goods. It's difficult enough when you are straight. I resolved to adapt. That's what evolution is for, I reasoned. If the mountain wouldn't move in my general direction, then I would jolly well find out what all the fun was about and clamber aboard. Day 2 of rehearsals was looming large, and I was sure that eventually we would play something in tune that started or finished in time. And that, dear reader, that's exactly what happened. So there. Samson did have a record deal, and they had produced an album as a 3-piece with Paul on lead vocals. The album was ready to be released, but the slight technical hitch was the addition of a 4th member, for whom no useful purpose could be assigned on the record. The record label was an independent one, Laser Records, and the album was called Survivors, featuring a kindergarten bad taste painted sleeve with the band standing atop a mound of dead rock stars. On the credits were instructions to play loud when wrecked, and it was certainly advice that we heeded for the next couple of years. It's safe to say that almost every mishap, catastrophe and legal disaster that could befall a band happened to us over the next 2 years. We were sued, injuncted, arrested, on the run for various offences, and utterly misunderstood by everyone except our own mothers. The management were all accountants or company secretaries, and their skill set was recruiting accountants and financial personnel. They had offices on the top floor of a building in Blackfriars, wore suits, and were drunk for 50% of the day as part of their job description. There was some money they had obtained from a mystery backer, and that funded their foray into music. The other band they managed were the UK Subs, a hardcore punk band led by the evergreen Charlie Harper. I received a paycheck, £30 a week. In fact, it was an advance, so just a loan, really. It was thought great sport to fill in my first cheque payable to Bruce, as they had tied themselves in knots one drunken evening trying to remember the Bruce's Monty Python sketch. I wasn't very amused because I couldn't cash the cheque and I had to eat. Bruce then went down the slippery slope of acceptance as my stage name, something I was not entirely happy with. I thought it pretty stupid, really, although not nearly as daft as the name of the movement that I had suddenly been co-opted into, unaware as I was of its existence. The new wave of British heavy metal was cooked up as a musical movement during a boozy lunchtime session involving journalists from Sounds magazine. Fed up with being seen as the idiot brother of the New Musical Express, they decided to fight back with a new wave of their own. It was a preposterous title, shortened to the equally incomprehensible NWOBHM, pronounced New Wobbum. The bands involved suddenly found themselves in a national music paper, to their great surprise in some cases. The new Wobbum was nothing of the sort. It was an old wave that had been ignored by the mainstream media in favour of punk, which, with its Vivienne Westwood fashion links and faux class war rhetoric, was more palatable to journalists who had aspirations beyond mere music. The bands that inspired this new Wobbum were solidly traditional and, in the main, still going strong. To read contemporary music criticism, you could be forgiven for thinking that rock music had ceased to exist in 1979. Far from it. Judas Priest, Motorhead, the Scorpions and various offshoots of Deep Purple were all selling out theatres and arenas in spite of the media attention lavished elsewhere. In Samson, I was suddenly a member of the new Wobbum. Alistair Primrose claimed to have invented the roadshow that fated the movement. "Dear boy," he would say in his high-pitched country reverend voice, "we're going on a heavy metal crusade."